Hello, and welcome back to another episode of Reading Rule, y'all. I'm your host, Dr. Shay Parton, and on today's episode, I'll be talking about potential teaching approaches for Tim Lockett's Whippoorwill award-winning book, Tell It True. In the last episode, I gave a brief summary and analysis of the book. So if you're here and not sure what the book is about, check out that video for more details on that, and you'll learn a little bit more about the book there. Last time, we ended with a question: if their local news isn't really local, then whose perspective are they getting and what are they missing out on in terms of what's happening in their own community? So because Birmingham Buzz is sort of this major, larger news, not really conglomerate, but it's a lot bigger than Beachside for sure, and it encompasses more than just their county and sort of focuses on the news that's going on in Birmingham. Then what does that mean about the sort of news that Lisa's tiny town of Beachside is getting, and what does that mean about who's doing their reporting and what their perspective is on Beachside and the things that are happening there? So I think that's a really major question, and it's actually a growing problem in rural areas where funding a local news source is more difficult than in bigger areas. My cousin works as the editor for the newspaper in the small town both my parents are from. They still do print of a print paper, but it seems like their news office is housed within a larger organization that includes some of the other surrounding towns. And I'm not actually really sure how that works, but what I do know is that they're still reporting local news there. Everyone really reads the local paper, and that's where a lot of them get their local news. But in the town where I grew up, there was no local paper for pretty much my entire childhood. It wasn't until I left that a local man started basically volunteering his time to report the local news, including the high school sporting events, award ceremonies, plays, concerts, and such, as well as things like my younger brother's sweet corn stand. And this was really nice because the school had a yearbook class and a media class that produced a show to run the announcements, but didn't have a school paper. The school where I taught also didn't have a school paper and got its news from larger nearby towns. And there was an article in the Daily Yonder, which is sort of a big, major, rural-focused news source. Recently, they ran a piece about a town trying desperately to save its paper that's been run by the same woman for decades. I'll put a link in the description to that source if you're interested in looking at it. But suffice it to say that this is a fairly common occurrence. And with the advent of internet and social media, I reckon folks could argue that a print paper or even an online one isn't necessary for local areas or small local areas, but I'd have to disagree. Journalism and reporting the news has an important and heralded history, one that has historically strived to be unbiased, if humans can even be such a thing. It seems until maybe now, that is. But in today's world of alternative facts and fake news, all people need to be able to evaluate the truth of their news, the humanity of both the story and the reporter. And I think that there's no better way to do that than to put together a newspaper themselves. And it's also a really great way for students to work through the writing process. So because of the way that news gets taken up by social media and gets disseminated so widely, so quickly, I think that it would be really beneficial for students to see how newspapers are put together and also to engage in that work themselves to report the local news of their small towns. And who knows, that might spark something bigger, and maybe a local newspaper will, pop up. When I come up with these teaching ideas, I base all of these ideas on how I would do this if I was still in my rural classroom. So that being said, some of y'all watching this might have local newspapers in your rural towns, but I didn't. And you might also have school newspapers, but I didn't. So I'm basing this idea on how I would run it in my classroom, and but it's flexible and malleable, and you could change it however you needed to in order for it to fit your specific situation. If I was doing this in my class, we would sort of become a news office, and we would research the different steps of putting the paper together. Students would decide what kinds of columns they wanted to include in their paper and collect topics of interest from around the school and community in the collection phase of the writing process. Then they would draft and workshop, revise, typeset, and get their stories ready for printing. We could use Canva or a site like that to make our stories look like a real newspaper and then print them. It would be really awesome to partner with the art class maybe around printing techniques and make their work an actual newspaper on that bigger paper. But an 8.5 by 11 paper would still be great. And printed out and shared through the school, teacher's lounge, front office, school and community, library, etc. From beginning to end, it would be theirs. It would be their local news, things that are important to their community and important to them. So now if your school already has a journalism class, like Lisa's in the book, or you already have a school newspaper, that's really fabulous. I'm so glad about that. But you could have your class partner with the students who are already working for the paper and sort of learn how they put things together and how they work. You could have them shadow the student journalists and the editors in that course, doing some research on the history and current state of news reporting, shadowing folks at the school or local paper. You could even, maybe ask some local journalists to come in and talk to the class. That would also really be wonderful, which is also something that I would do. I would probably ask someone at the larger news office to come in and talk a little bit about what it is and means to be a journalist and what that looks like. But all of those things together, I think, would help students have a better understanding of how journalists report the news and what that looks like in terms of the writing process and the printing process. And after all, at the end of the story, after the end of Tell It True, Lisa's role as a journalist teaches her so much about herself, about humanity, about being a writer, about writing itself, and most importantly, about telling it true. It would be really great for students to get that experience. And so I would love to do this in my classroom. Man, this sounds so fun. And like it could hit a lot of the standards around reading and writing nonfiction, especially, which sometimes I think is harder to figure out what you want to do in your classroom, especially to get students engaged with nonfiction. So this makes me really wish I was still in my rural classroom. I hope you'll consider giving this a try. And if you do, I'd really love to know about it. That's it for today's episode. Stay tuned for next time when I sit down with Lockette himself to talk with him about rurality, place, writing, journalism, all the things. Thanks for stopping by, y'all. And come back now, would you?